It's only when each one of us strives to develop leadership qualities that we can collaborate towards a cause bigger than ourselves, the sustainability of mankind's survival. Today, we are a self-destructive society due to overabundance, and we have become stagnant in our progress as a species. Good leaders must steer us through the right course so that we may progress, but this doesn't mean that we sit and wait for someone to come and redeem us. We have to take charge ourselves. Simon Sinek retraces our roots as hunters and gatherers in order to demonstrate how true leaders perform in the modern world. He provides an in-depth take on human physiology to exhibit how we have always been built to work together. Endorphins, dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, these chemicals serve as powerful forces that drive man towards cooperation and survival. He states that, like our primitive selves, we are still dependent on them. With the right balance of these chemicals, we can form strong organizations built on cooperation, trust, love, and loyalty. To demonstrate this, Sinek provides examples of real individuals and organizations that have both failed and succeeded throughout history, clarifying the difference between groups who have unhealthy cultures of self-preservation versus those who've built strong circles of safety that prioritize the collective. He sheds light on the sins of the past and how we transformed ourselves into a society of dehumanization and abstraction. Fortunately, we can adopt values that will help us rise from the slump in the form of 5 rules. Keeping it real, keeping it manageable, meeting the people we help, giving them time and not just money, and being patient. We have to look back to a time when enough was in order to live within our means today and onwards to the future. Sinek educates us on destructive abundance and the leadership lessons we have to learn so we could breed good cultures and thus good leaders, all while understanding the true nature of power, recognizing the significance of integrity, and considering humans not as numbers but as the people they are. Our self-centeredness threatens these values as we have become a society of addicts enslaved by the instantaneous, feel-good dopamine high from addictive substances and technological distractions. Sinek likens this modern addiction to a substance abuse itself. We cannot be cured by standing alone. It is only through sharing the struggle with others that we can rise above it, and the strongest motivation we have towards our own betterment is a cause bigger than ourselves, a purpose that serves the entire community. Sinek recognizes that when a goal is beyond our resources but within our capabilities, we will strive to achieve it no matter what. Our goal is to make sure mankind lives today and survives tomorrow, leaving a legacy that will keep the global community strong for generations to come. We need leaders to guide us through this path. But no matter how relevant hierarchy is to maintaining order, Sinek tells us that it's not up to a chosen few to solve the problems of the modern world. Leaders Eat Last concludes with this most significant war cry. We must all act like the leaders we dream to follow. Modern institutions and training programs teach us that it's important to nurture managerial skills, failing to recognize that it's much more significant to train effective leaders. This is the paradigm that Leaders Eat Last aims to shift. Simon Sinek emphasizes that the success of any organization depends on leadership excellence as a whole, not just the leader's critical thinking abilities or decision-making prowess. This is exactly why he uses the United States Marine Corps as a best example. given that this branch of the U.S. military exhibits teamwork and shared values while being a model for interpersonal relationships. The connections within are so vital, especially when the cost of a failed mission is fatal and success is the only acceptable result. The effective dynamics of the interpersonal connections within the Marine Corps are best displayed when the team gathers to eat. The juniors are served first and the seniors last, and the behavior isn't forced by any means. One principle is emphasized. True leaders place the interest of others above their own. Sinek provides an in-depth explanation of such human behaviors of true leaders that are beyond managerial. Our need to feel safe. Protection from above. 22 men, deep in enemy territory, have captured a high-value target in Afghanistan. Captain Mike Drowley, nicknamed Johnny Bravo, instinctively took the risk of piloting his aircraft out of safety to be near his troops on the ground. He felt his men were in trouble before they gave him the signal, and he was right. On August 16, 2002, he found himself in a combat situation for the first time. With limited resources and equipment, he had to rely on his capabilities to hit back at the enemy without harming his own men. When he ran out of ammo, Johnny Bravo skillfully led his wingmen to lay down fire on cue. With all 22 men coming home alive, that night's mission had been a success. The value of empathy. For Johnny Bravo, rewards from the top don't matter as much as service and self-sacrifice for others. And if he were to receive any recognition, he believes it will be for the greatest asset he brings to the table: empathy. Employees are people too. For Mike Merck and Ron Campbell, longtime employees at Hasten Sandy Acre, each workday had been all about starting at the bell and flipping machine switches, until Bob Chapman took over as CEO. Chapman acquired many companies that were on the brink of failure, breathing life back into them, all because he brought with him a willingness to listen. Ron told him how factory floor workers had to ask permission for the smallest freedoms. He felt that the company didn't trust them. Chapman made sure to change this system towards a more caring and trusting environment. It wasn't long until the workday felt like time spent with family, and the company thrived. The culture of trust and care that Chapman introduced inspired workers to work better, increasing the company's revenue from $55 million to $95 million after 5 years, all because the workers felt that they were valued. We see what we want to see. Chapman's eyes were opened to the harsh reality of the Hasten Sandy Acre workplace when he witnessed 2 employees suddenly changing from a good mood to a sullen demeanor once they were needed back on the floor. Before then, Chapman was only an excellent executive in the technical sense, good with numbers and making the hard decisions. After what he witnessed, he determined to improve the workplace environment in the aspect of care. His approach to the situation of Hasten Sandy Acre became his general model for managing his operation. He understood that the human mind constantly tries to find the most suitable situations to thrive and feel safe, and that a true leader protects the organization from internal conflict, much like how each part of the human body must cooperate in order for a person to live. This biological and anthropological view dictates that the right conditions must be met in order for members of a single body to work together, a pattern that can be observed in the most successful organizations. Yet, it seems that the modern world has not adopted this approach as much as needed. A majority of today's organizations are solely profit-driven with short-term goals in view, making work for employees obligatory and unsatisfactory. The impact that this has on society goes beyond work and into the home, as a dissatisfied worker may project negatively on his family. Chapman's approach aims that each worker may come home feeling inspired and fulfilled. The awesome responsibility. Chapman realized that, like the father of the bride entrusting his daughter to the groom, a leader of a company also becomes responsible for the welfare of its employees as they are handed over to the organization. When a leader acts like a parent and the company feels like a family, its members are loyal and proud of their identity. A high-performing company uses its money to help grow its people, which would enable the company to achieve true, long-term success, as opposed to an organization that puts money as its first priority. A leader who puts the people first only ever increases his credibility because excellent employee performance makes him look like a genius. Sinek realizes that such conditions may seem too idealistic, but it's undeniable that concrete examples do exist. The challenge now is for us to promulgate the importance of a culture of care within every organization, and, in its absence, to care for one another like leaders should. Belonging. From me to we. When George finished his military training, he was confident and committed to his fellow United States Marines. With no threat of internal conflicts, they were ready for any outside dangers. As a unit, they were within the circle of safety. With organizations, dangers come in the form of competition, obsoleteness, and meeting expectations. Among its people, there exists the threat of rejection, isolation, and the like. But these can be addressed if the people are enveloped by a sense of belongingness, a circle of safety, creating unity and teamwork. We can focus more on protecting the group from outside dangers when we don't have to protect ourselves from each other. Aside from the example of the Marines, people can draw inspiration from the Greek warrior society, the Spartans, who derived their strength mainly from the collective defense of their shields rather than individual spears or helms. It is the leader's responsibility to make sure everyone in the group pulls together in the same way. Furthermore, the leader determines how the circle expands by adopting new children or taking on new members. Once the circle has grown, he is in charge of overseeing the layers of management, making sure both his senior officers and the rest of the group are given equal consideration. This helps prevent unhealthy internal politics or self-preservation behaviors that threaten unity. When the circle of safety is strong, the group is trusting, collaborative, and innovative. And then the twist. Leaders need to feel safe too. It's the responsibility of the members to openly communicate any concerns they may have regarding their leader's welfare. Yeah, but Ken, a mid-ranking executive for a large bank, seemed happy when making a good living. But deep inside, he wanted to quit and do something else entirely, except when he thought about his kids and the mortgage, he knew he didn't have a choice but to be a responsible man of the house when it meant he had to work a job he didn't love. Sinek recognizes the seemingly impossible challenge for companies to put their people first before the business, especially considering return on investment, or ROI, annual goals, competition, Wall Street, and all the external dangers to a company's success. Most of us, like Ken, see the reality of life and work the same way, that in order to satisfy a certain lifestyle, we must give up true happiness and fulfillment at work. But Sinek warns that job stability is a myth and that it demands a high price, a man's health. A study by the University of Canberra, Australia in 2011 shows that people who are unhappy at work suffer from depression, anxiety, and stress, sometimes even the same as or worse than those who don't have a job at all. And when one is dissatisfied with work, the decision to change jobs comes easily. Sinek points the blame less at the nature of the job and more towards weak management and leadership, as the absence of a sense of belongingness breeds disloyalty. Similarly, according to a study by the University College London, people who don't feel recognized enough for their efforts at work tend to suffer from heart disease. The results of a Gallup poll in 2013 also shows that when leaders ignore their employees, 40% of them become detached from their work, and, surprisingly, only 22% do the same when criticized by the boss. This shows that it's the acknowledgement itself that matters, and when receiving positive recognition, only 1% of employees disengage from the job. Sinek emphasizes that it's the companies that nurture misery that reach their demise. The Whitehall Studies. The Whitehall studies were conducted by scientists in Britain to examine the correlation between an individual's rank on the corporate ladder and stress. The researchers discovered that stress wasn't caused by higher ranking, but by a lower degree of control that an employee feels throughout the workday. Surprising results were also found in a 2012 study by Harvard and Stanford on Harvard's executive MBA program, showing that leaders had lower stress levels than their subordinates. Results from the Whitehall studies dramatically show that stress-induced health risks and mental illness are more present in those with lower ranks and not the other way around as commonly believed. But Sinek emphasizes that going up the hierarchy is not the solution. Rather, it is an empowering, safe, and supportive work environment that can improve workers' lives. Despite all this data, people have settled for uncomfortable work environments and do nothing to improve them. The solution is not necessarily to leave, but to adopt a new attitude by focusing on others in the workplace rather than ourselves, believing that, like the Spartans, one's strength comes from each other's protection. A study from Boston College shows that children are affected not by how long their parents are out for work, but by the mood they bring home afterwards. So, even if one believes that putting up with the misery at work is the responsible way of helping the home, in truth, it's doing the family more harm. The leaders of companies must build and maintain circles of safety in the workplace in order to eliminate the risks to the health and welfare of employees. Powerful forces. When enough was enough. Sinek paints a picture of human life in the Paleolithic era to emphasize how human physiology and cooperative instincts have allowed man to survive a world void of modern advantages. Back then, there was no question of whether or not man needed to cooperate with one another. Humans automatically recognized this essentiality and successfully faced danger together. Today's leaders need to understand that this primal instinct remains true. That if members of an organization are preoccupied with protecting themselves from one another, both outside threats and opportunities will be missed. In the beginning, because of cooperation, man not only survived, but also thrived. Our capability of working together enabled us to change the environment to suit our needs rather than changing ourselves to suit our conditions. Our genetic coding is unchanged, but our world has modernized, and this comes with both advantages and costs. It's all about the group. Back when we were simple hunters and gatherers, humans gave the utmost importance to trust and cooperative relationships. Protecting our own was top priority, especially when there were more than enough dangers from the external forces of nature. This was true across all continents of the world, proving that it wasn't the environment that prompted the behavior, but the human design itself. Social interactions and bonds had been as essential to organizations then as they are now. Our chemical dependency. Aside from the survival instinct hardwired into man's physiology, the quest for happiness is also deeply ingrained within us. There exists an incentive system that conditions us to behave in certain ways in exchange for rewards, positive feelings caused by chemicals in the human body. For happiness, they are endorphins, dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. The paradox of being human. Although it is essential to behave with the collective in consideration, humans can't help but weigh concern for themselves versus the tribe. This creates conflict of interest, also present in our genetic code. The first two happy chemicals in human biology, endorphins and dopamine, are coined by Sinek as selfish chemicals because their purpose is to drive an individual to care for himself, finding food, building shelter, inventing tools. In contrast, the selfless chemicals, serotonin and oxytocin, encourage us to work together by making us feel trustful and loyal. Finding the right balance between self-interest and that of the community is the key to our long-term survival. EDSO. Without selfish chemicals, we would starve to death. Though it seems logical for us to go hunting only when we feel hungry, it's highly inconvenient in the practical sense. Today, we find ourselves shopping for groceries even when we're not experiencing hunger pangs. The selfish chemicals, endorphins and dopamine, drive us to hunt and gather, enabling our survival and progress. E is for endorphins. The endorphin chemical acts like an opiate, giving us pleasure instead of stress and discomfort, an experience of the runner's high. This biological response gave us an advantage in the Paleolithic era when it was necessary to travel great distances while hunting. Another behavior that helps the body release endorphins is laughter. A little lightheartedness can go a long way in reducing tension and preventing us from being afraid. D is for dopamine, an incentive for progress. Dopamine makes us feel satisfaction after accomplishing a task. In terms of hunting and gathering, dopamine provides us the good feeling from eating a meal, encouraging us to repeat this behavior. Increasing progress also increases dopamine levels in the body, and in the moment we achieve our goal, we get the biggest hit of dopamine chemical as a reward, making us biased towards progress. Our goals must be tangible. Humans are visually oriented. This is the main reason why it helps when we put our goals in writing. This behavior enables us to correctly set our objectives and measure our progress towards attaining them. For instance, a person who follows a specific budget will more likely be able to save money, and organizations implement a detailed vision statement by which their members would abide. A company that sets its vision statement as being the best company in the country isn't doing very well with delegating its goals. In contrast, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once stated that his dream was to see little black boys and girls joining hands with little white boys and girls, a vision that we could clearly imagine and plan for. It's all well and good when our body rewards us with dopamine for healthy behaviors. But nowadays we are challenged by drug addiction, alcoholism, and gambling, activities that also trigger the release of dopamine chemicals. Modern perks like receiving a text or getting likes from social media have formed neural connections in our brains so strong that we find ourselves craving the dopamine hits we get from them. In fact, most of our hobbies have no logical benefits, but they will satisfy man's prehistoric foraging desires. On the bright side, the feel-good sensations we experience are also triggered by gaining trust, love, and loyalty from others. encouraging us to work together and accomplish more than we could do alone. The selfless chemicals. Serotonin and oxytocin provide us the feeling of belongingness within a group, strengthening the circle of safety. Without social chemicals, we'd be cold-blooded. In the wild, we can observe the behavior of crocodiles in competition for food. The faster and stronger animal will always get the food first, and the weaker one swims away, bearing no ill will against the victor. Most animals are cold-hearted loners by design. Our brains still carry a reptilian portion as a remnant of evolution, but we've developed a mammalian layer that transformed us into social beings. We formed tribes and adopted cooperative behavior to help us survive, especially when our physiological design isn't as hardy as a crocodile or a shark anatomy. We need the circle of safety, and that's where serotonin and oxytocin play their part. These chemicals encourage the formation of social bonds as they reward us with feelings of belongingness, trust, and security. But when the environment of an organization inhibits these social incentives, stress, paranoia, and mistrust ensue, creating a vicious cycle of selfishness and failure of the organization. The right conditions must be met in order for us to pull together and succeed. S is for serotonin, the leadership chemical. Serotonin gives us the feeling of pride when we gain respect, strength, and confidence. It is especially present when we get approval from or feel valued by the members of our tribe. The chemical works in two ways. The receiver of approval gets big serotonin hits, while those that give approval experience the same biological reaction and feel equally as proud, strengthening the bonds between them. For example, crossing the finish line alone doesn't feel as satisfying as having witnesses to cheer for us. Serotonin helps us feel accountable to others for their support, so we aim to make others admire us even more. In turn, we gain a higher status within the group and work even harder for it, eventually turning us into leaders. O is for oxytocin, chemical love. Oxytocin provides a deeper feeling of friendship, trust, and love, encouraging generosity and empathy. The human body releases this chemical when we are with our closest friends and loved ones. Unlike dopamine, oxytocin gives long-lasting gratification. When we spend a lot of time with someone, the spontaneous dopamine hits are gradually replaced by a stable oxytocin level. We end up trusting others to protect us when we are weak. Sinek emphasizes his favorite definition of love: giving someone the capacity to destroy us while trusting that they won't. Even with our individualism, we are still biologically designed to seek comfort and support from our tribe. We eliminate anxiety and susceptibility, triggered by the chemical cortisol, by surrounding ourselves with others within a circle of safety, thanks to high doses of oxytocin. The Big C. Another benefit of living in groups is that each member can protect the tribe by watching out for danger. We have a biological early warning system built into our body that helps us sense imminent threats. Johnny Bravo's encounter in Afghanistan is the perfect example. He and his 22 men all had that gut feeling that something was wrong. This feeling is caused by the chemical cortisol. Such scenarios aren't limited to life-threatening experiences like combat or predation. For instance, forthcoming layoffs in an office scenario is a form of pressing danger. And when the actual threat presents itself, we get a large dose of adrenaline that boosts our strength to fight for ourselves. Otherwise, we wait for the cortisol to leave our bloodstream as we return to a relaxed state. The fact is that cortisol wasn't intended for long-term presence within our bodies, as the stress it causes is serious. In a less than ideal environment, the existence of a constant low-grade anxiety inhibits the formation of a circle of safety, thereby threatening the survival of all members of the group. There is no trust or bond between workers and leaders. Signs of impending danger are kept secret for the purposes of self-preservation. And the cortisol keeps coursing through the veins, inhibiting the release of oxytocin. This starts a counterproductive cycle. In time, we learn to cope with this unhealthy condition, unaware of the slow destruction it inflicts upon the mind and the body. In the face of immediate danger, cortisol tags the immune system as a non-essential element for responding to the threat. Thus, the constant presence of cortisol makes us vulnerable to sickness. It is then no surprise that the demands of the modern world have coincided with an increase in cases of cancer, heart disease, and the like. A good organizational culture isn't optional, but necessary for our health and well-being. Fire your children. Charlie Kim, the founder of the company Next Jump, has dedicated his efforts to creating a strong circle of safety for his employees. He implemented a lifetime employment scheme where, in the case of poor performance, employees are coached instead of getting fired. He says that this tough love demands more time and resources, but is ultimately more effective than laying people off. Because of the company's dedication to its people, lines of communication are more open, the turnover rate is only 1%, and revenue growth has skyrocketed to 60% per year. Even when the employees were offered bigger salaries by other companies, they chose to stay, indicating that safety and belongingness are rewards that far outweigh monetary compensation. When somebody says they love their job, this only means that they maintain healthy levels of oxytocin and serotonin in their workspace. This circle of safety is feasible for industries of all kinds and sizes as long as their leaders decide to pursue it. Why we have leaders. Without hierarchy in a tribal situation, its members will be in constant conflict with each other as to who gets the best resources. This means that less aggressive members get left behind. Mother Nature has determined to ensure the survival of all humans through the designation of leadership that will enforce order within a group. We respect the higher status of the alphas in society and strive to improve our own status in the community. But the cost of leadership is self-interest. When the tribe faces danger, the leader is expected to be the one to rush in before anyone else to protect the group. After all, he is the strongest member with higher serotonin levels that boost his confidence more than the rest. This is also precisely why he gets the first choice for a mate. We recognize that his good genes are an asset that must be passed on to future generations. Aside from recognizing the benefits that a leader deserves, we also intelligently determine the limits of the compensations awarded to him depending on his contribution. Thus, reputation becomes important. For instance, we wouldn't hesitate to reward people like Mother Teresa, and celebrity publicists advise their clients to get involved in charitable works to legitimize the benefits they gain from their status. But the true leader is one who is willing to give up all these perks to serve others. They are the ones who rise through the ranks not because they wanted it, but because the people put them there. The Ceramic Cup. A story about a former Undersecretary of Defense sheds light on another aspect of the leader position. When he held office, he enjoyed the perks of flying business class, being escorted into his pre-booked hotel room and sipping coffee from a ceramic cup. But when he wasn't the undersecretary anymore, he flew coach, checked himself into his room, and drank his coffee from a styrofoam cup instead. The lesson is this: all the advantages that one gets from holding a high position aren't meant to honor the person, but for the responsibility he holds. Eating last is repaid with loyalty and hard work. Barry Waymiller took a hard hit from the stock market crash of 2008. But instead of laying off his people, their CEO devised a system where each employee, regardless of rank, would take 4 weeks of unpaid time off to help the company keep afloat. Instead of self-preservation, camaraderie was present. Those who could afford to take time off traded with others who needed their salary more. This was how the employees repaid their alpha's protection, with loyalty and cooperation. EDSO Revisited. All the feel-good chemicals in our body are ever present. Therefore, we must ensure that we shape our environments to promote the release of the right chemicals for the right reasons. The leader of an organization is the one responsible for overseeing that the delicate balance between these chemicals is maintained. Reality. The courage to do the right thing. Know when to break the rules. In any organization, rules are implemented to ensure that operations go smoothly and dangers are averted. But sometimes, certain situations call for us to trust our experts even while they break the rules. Would it give anyone peace of mind if they knew their family was on a flight piloted by someone who would perform by the book no matter what? Rules are mere guidelines, and we cannot completely trust technology no matter how sophisticated it may be. People don't trust rules. They trust people. Our relationships don't rely on variables or protocol. It is then a leader's duty to train his people about the rules while emphasizing that members can completely trust one another. Only then can each person within the organization courageously and confidently do what's right, even if it means disregarding the rule book. Snowmobile in the desert. It isn't difficult to see how intelligent we are as beings when we look at what humanity has accomplished throughout its existence. This is thanks to the neocortex part of our brains. Yet, no matter how smart a person is, he won't survive without trusting and cooperating with others. Our emotions are controlled by our primitive limbic brain, and it's only through the combination of smarts and working together that we ever really accomplish anything of real value. The human pursuit of advancement has paradoxically made it more difficult to promote cooperation. Sadly, our current organizations and systems encourage self-preservation and suspicion against others. Like a snowmobile taken into the desert, humans are specifically designed for the right environment and will not function well otherwise. Incentive systems force us to work harder even when out of our element, yet the friction is also increased. Trust is the lubrication we need. But, then again, why did we ever place ourselves in the desert in the first place? How we got here. The boom before the bust. It was after World War I, the Roaring Twenties, when America experienced a commercial and consumerist boom. The people had money, and advancements in technology and media made waves all throughout the country. New industries sprang forth, creating new demands, but with all the excess came a lot of waste as well. The Depression was the inevitable result. But in 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor forced America out of the slump and into World War II. It was during this time that the entire country, the greatest generation, worked together for a cause. And so as the country left the time of war and welcomed the 1950s, a sense of hard work, cooperation, and loyalty had been instilled into the consciousness of the people. All seemed well, but not for long. The 800-pound boomer in the room. After the war came the sudden growth in population, the baby boom. adding 76 million Americans to the citizenry from the 1950s to 1964. Unlike their parents, the greatest generation, the boomers had grown up in wealth and prosperity, and the differences between the two generations created tension. The maturing boomers grew up to be more selfish and concerned only for their own happiness, the me decade, as Thomas Wolfe described in a 1976 New York magazine. Modern theories about conducting business became known in the late 1970s, and people were inclined to focus on protecting personal wealth. By the time the 1980s and 1990s rolled in, the boomer generation had risen to positions of power, forever changing the face of the nation. The boomers, all grown up. In the 1980s, Bill Gates had been the young founder of Microsoft, envisioning a PC on every desk. The development of computers and other technology encouraged individualism and ease of use through disposability, even the aspect of people as being expendable resources. The day we embraced layoffs. On August 5, 1981, President Ronald Reagan fired 11,359 air traffic controllers who were members of the PATCO union. They were demanding higher pay and lesser work hours, but negotiation talks had been unsuccessful. On August 3rd, they went on strike, provoking Reagan to ban every last one of them from working for the FAA. It isn't a question of whether or not Reagan's actions were justified. Rather, it's a matter of what message it sent to the leaders of the business world. He may not have intended it, but this event introduced the idea of saving the organization from economic failure at the expense of the people's protection as the sensible first choice rather than the last resort. This is in total contrast to the protection that our anthropological nature expects from our leaders. We forget that in the first place, it is the people who are the most valuable resources of the organization, as they are the inventors and innovators of the products and services that bring success. Nonetheless, many company leaders have succumbed to the expectations of outside entities, unknowingly reducing their own company's capacity to perform. When leaders eat first. The stock market crashes resulting from the unintentional mismanagement of resources by the boomers indicate how the modern environments we've created for ourselves have frustrated our natural inclinations for trust and cooperation towards survival. The business society has implemented a set of norms that are more dopamine-driven, that's short-term achievement, and less serotonin and oxytocin-driven, long-term community process. This imbalance caused the stock market crash, an event that displays the natural tendency of the world to correct itself and regain balance, a phenomenon that has resounded throughout our history. Today, we lack true leaders who abide by empathy and humanity, and so the vicious cycle goes on. Dehumanization. Amidst the abundance of the modern world, our anthropological assessment of the value of things is abstracted. The more we have a certain thing, the less we value it, until the essential human concepts lose their meaning. The idea of a person is diminished when he is viewed as nothing but a consumer, an online profile, employee, or expense. We struggle to cooperate in a world of strangers. We must find a way to eliminate the abstraction that can damage our economy. The abstract challenge. Abstraction kills. The aftermath of the Nazi genocide of World War II posed the question of what had driven such a massive number of people to commit crimes against humanity. And the simplest answer was that they were just following orders. In 1961, Stanley Milgram, a psychologist from Yale, studied the extent of human obedience to authority. He experimented on 160 volunteers, the teachers, commanding them to flip a series of switches specifically labeled to give the impression that they were activating varying degrees of electric shock affecting another person, the student. In truth, the student was also a researcher pretending to feel pain from the shocks he received. When the teachers could hear the student's reaction to the pain, a majority strongly opposed continuing the experiment. But when the student had been placed in a different room, unheard except for thumping on the walls, a majority of the teachers proceeded to flip the switches all the way to the highest degree of shock, all because the scientist, the higher authority, told them to continue. When the truth was revealed, some participants still felt remorse for their actions, while others end up blaming the scientist and even the student, stating that he was stupid and deserved to be shocked. The takeaway is that in the duration of the experiment, no one asked about the well-being of the student in the other room. They were more concerned about saving their own skins from the consequences of disobedience. Although Milgram's experiment is obviously unethical, it proves to show the scale with which abstraction can allow us to become inhuman. Modern abstraction. Milgram's findings come to life. When the impact of our words and actions are abstracted from our view, we are taken down the dangerous path of harming other people for self-preservation. In modern society, for example, we can find concrete cases of food industry companies who value money over people so much that they are prepared to sell corrupted products to increase profit, risking the health of the public. When we detach ourselves from the people we hurt, it's easier for us to focus on our selfish desires and find any justifications for our actions, valid or not. The responsibility of business. Capitalist entities justify their actions by referencing the letter of the law as long as they can use its loopholes for personal gain, even when it allows them to turn a blind eye from moral responsibility. For instance, Apple Incorporated does not deny its taking advantage of weaknesses in tax laws that allowed it to keep $74 billion from the IRS. Technically, they broke no rules, but the human sense of right and wrong is seen from beyond the perspective of the law. Within the law. Like Apple, the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, owner of the Titanic, evaded additional costs by simply following the rules. They carried only 16 inflatable rafts as required by law, even when it needed 4 times that number to fit all passengers. Thus, more than half of the passengers died when the ship sank. We need leaders who can provide us with a higher and noble authority, a moral code, to empower us to do the right thing even when we have to sacrifice our self-interests. Like Johnny Bravo, who, instead of staying safe above the clouds, chose to risk his life for his men, we are still capable of managing abstraction. Managing the abstraction. Numbers of people aren't people, they're numbers. When we use numbers to represent people, we agree with Stalin, who famously said that the death of one man is a tragedy, but the death of a million is a statistic. Human life loses meaning when we see numbers rather than the people in need of aid. Empathy falters. Our innovations only ever mean anything when they recognize the real people behind the numbers. Rule number 1. Keep it real, bring people together. The Internet has made the problem of abstraction even more complex. It provides the screen behind which people can hide after displaying distasteful behavior. Online relationships seem real to us, but they are only truly legitimized when we meet face to face. Real trust can only be built through live interaction. Virtual trust doesn't exist. Rule number 2. Keep it manageable. Obey Dunbar's number. Robin Dunbar, a British anthropologist and professor at Oxford University, concluded that a person cannot maintain more than 150 close relationships. The earliest groups of Homo sapiens, and even a company of Marines, are each composed of only about 150 people. Any more and the system will most likely collapse. This is why senior leaders designate mid-level leaders to manage larger groups. Dunbar's research proves that when a group gets bigger than 150 members, levels of cooperation and hard work decline. Our anthropological design dictates that we only really care for people we personally know, and the larger the group, the fewer chances we have of forming trusting relationships with everyone. Rule number 3. Meet the people you help. It is imperative for humans to see tangible proof of our work's meaning in order to feel motivated to do better. For instance, a bank's employees would gain inspiration from people who testify about how their bank loans have saved their homes and families. Unfortunately, most organizations of today are lacking in this aspect, relying on figures to display the results of human efforts. Being social animals, humans would respond better not with unfeeling numbers, but with a humane sense of purpose. Rule number 4. Give them time, not just money. Our tribal inclinations have taught us to value time and effort spent for us above everything else. But in modern society, money has become the concrete representation of effort, though not quite as valuable as the real thing. A person's time and energy are finite, while money can be earned and accumulated. Thus, an organization can't buy the loyalty of its members with money alone. We get a dose of feel-good chemicals when we give and receive money, but it doesn't last long, and it doesn't create an impact on others the same way an effort could. For example, a notorious CEO won't be able to restore a good reputation just by donating to charity. Giving and receiving time and effort runs both ways for leaders and their people. Rule number 5. Be patient. The rule of 7 days and 7 years. It should take more than 7 days and fewer than 7 years before we can correctly decide whether or not our relationship with a person is truly a bond of human trust. Our modern world is filled with instant gratification, short-term shots of dopamine. We get what we want, and we get it now. It's convenient when we're researching online or shopping, but we mustn't forget that forming true relationships takes patience. Imbalance. In ancient times, humans never had more than they needed. Some had more surplus than others, and any mismanagement tends to create imbalance, leading to destructive abundance. Integrity falters, and the absence of cooperation breeds unhealthy politics. This is a result wherein the members of an organization give more value to results than people and purpose. Destructive abundance. Leadership Lesson 1. So goes the culture, so goes the company. A culture sacrificed. From the 1970s to the 1990s, Goldman Sachs was a firm that operated under the ideal of long-term greed. This meant that its members were willing to take hits if it would ensure the loyalty of their clients and help them reap benefits in the long run. But well into the 1990s, a new dopamine-driven culture had been introduced, and the organization was split between the old Goldman, built on loyalty, and the new Goldman, built on numbers and short-term goals. By 2010, Goldman Sachs had become a symbol of excess and greed, a sign of their watered-down culture. Internally, teams were pitted against one another, and nobody felt safe about their job. Employment at Goldman used to mean being Boy Scouts, something more than an occupation. But none of its workers identify with the company as proudly as before, because the culture of an organization reflects on the character of its people. Things could have ended differently if the organization's leaders hadn't allowed the destructive culture to take hold. Bad cultures breed bad leaders. Kim Stewart described the culture at Citigroup to be that of self-preservation and fear. A crab mentality had permeated the system, and employees withheld information from one another in order to get the advantage. Inevitably, the company suffered financial losses and mass layoffs. But the leadership hadn't been humbled by its defeat. Stewart's boss still managed to say he wasn't going to be the mentor who could give her career advice. So goes the culture. A culture protected. When Spencer Silver, a scientist at 3M, failed to develop a strong adhesive, he wasn't afraid to share his failure with his colleagues, as he thought the others may find a way to improve it. This was how Post-it notes were invented. The company's innovation was so strong that even in the tough economy of 2009, 3M managed to launch more than 1,000 new products. Their culture is a circle of safety wherein people trust one another to share both successes and failures. Their culture of cooperation and sharing paved the way for innovation. Leadership Lesson 2. So goes the leader, so goes the culture. I before you, me before we. Many modern organizations consider an employee-centric culture to be weak. This gives birth to dictatorships, not just in governments, but also in the workspace, where the leaders are unfeeling, absolute authorities, ready to expend the people for profit, self-interest, and control. This was the case with Stanley O'Neill at Merrill Lynch in 2001, who had alienated himself from his employees and encouraged internal competition. By October 2007, the company lost billions of dollars, and O'Neill's reign had come to an end. There was nobody left in the organization willing to support him. In the Atlantic Monthly, Mark Bowden wrote, "Power gradually shuts the tyrant off from the world. A leader who works purely for self-interest creates a cortisol-driven culture that will lead to nothing but collapse." True power. When Captain Marquette was transferred to the USS Santa Fe, he had been used to having full control of his ship. When he issued orders, the crew followed him blindly. Until one day, he ordered his navigator to turn up the speed to 2/3 setting. The submarine didn't go any faster. Captain Marquette didn't know that the Santa Fe was unlike the ship he was trained for, the Olympia, and so there was no 2/3 setting. He asked the navigator, who knew all along, why he had relayed the order despite the fact. The officer only responded with, "Because you told me to." Captain Marquette realized that those on top had all the authority, but those at the bottom had all the information. In any organization, being trained solely for compliance isn't enough. The leader shouldn't be the only one made accountable for the success and failure of the group. Rather, he is responsible for ensuring the success and protection of each member of his crew. The captain changed the culture of the team from permission to intent, literally banning the words "permission to" aboard the ship and replacing it with "I intend." This culture had improved the crew's performance so much so that a crew that was once considered the lowest rated in the U.S. submarine fleet, the Santa Fe had become the best rated crew in Navy history. Physics defines power as the transfer of energy. Organizations work the same way. The more energy is distributed across the system, the more each part of the body functions and empowers the leader. Leadership Lesson 3. Integrity matters. The Foxhole Test. The circle of safety in the Marine Corps is built on trust and integrity. The absence of these two qualities can mean certain death. No one in the group is expected to be right all the time, but each member must be prepared to take responsibility for his actions. True leadership isn't saying what we want to hear, but what we need to hear. The sample applies to every other organization, even when the situations within aren't matters of life and death. How not to build trust. Trust isn't awarded instantaneously. We constantly assess the information that people give us, and if their words and actions are consistent with their intentions, we see integrity in them. Thus, integrity is not a state of mind, but rather a practice that is exhibited when we are ready to be honest with each other, even in the face of disagreement or mistakes. Any attempts to protect one's image at all cost is considered suspicious. For example, we know that politicians who seem too agreeable during campaign season may be adopting a superficial facade, while those who show their less perfect, human side are deemed trustworthy in their authenticity. This is particularly important for leaders since their subordinates would almost always follow them blindly, believing they only have the best intentions for the group void of self-interest and abstraction. If this is the culture adopted by a leader, his members would do the same. But if they fail to tell the truth, the bond of trust is broken. Ultimately, the question we may ask ourselves is, would I want to be in the same foxhole as my leader? A corporate lesson in telling the truth. No company can guarantee that all their actions would be 100% fail-safe. Everyone understands that. The important thing is to be honest about one's mistakes. The Bank of America, for example, received a lot of backlash for wanting to charge their clients an additional $5 per month for making purchases using their debit card. They were forced to retract the decision after so much public outrage, but in doing so, they weren't honest about the necessity of charging the fee and why they changed their mind. If they had been straightforward about it, the situation would have turned in their favor, and their reputation could have been enhanced by their honesty. But they weren't ready to admit vulnerability. Hence, the people didn't trust the Bank of America enough to be in the same foxhole with them. Leadership Lesson 4. Friends Matter. To win or to serve. From the 1960s to 1980s, politics in Washington functioned relatively well despite its members belonging to opposing parties. The measure of success wasn't based on who held the majority, but rather on who got the work done. But in the early 1990s, Newt Gingrich, a Republican, determined it was necessary for his party to hold the majority, leaving cooperation out of the picture. The two parties were distanced from one another. There was little opportunity to build relationships based on trust. It had become all about serving one's own district rather than the collective, as politicians spent more time fundraising and building personal power. Hostilities between parties were at their peak, and Congress had become an ineffective governing body. It has gone as far as the public blaming the Congress's lack of collaboration for the economic crisis of 2008. Enemies fight, friends cooperate. The friendship between Bob Goodlatte, a Republican congressman from Virginia, and Stephanie Herseth Sandlin, a Democratic congressman from South Dakota, proves that, despite being adversaries at work, it's possible to set aside differences and build a bond of trust. They paid attention to each other, and when they disagreed, they compromised, simply because they knew cooperation doesn't have to mean unquestioned agreement. Rather, it's working together for the greater good. Their friendship has become a model for others in government. Leadership Lesson 5. Lead the people, not the numbers. Neutron Jack. In the 1970s, we learned how, in reality, a company's share price alone wasn't an indicator of its success. In response, corporate America assumed a movement that gave primary focus to shareholder values as the main fuel of the economy. business pioneers took companies with undervalued stocks, cut expenses, and focused on maximizing shareholder value. In the 1980s, Jack Welch, CEO of General Electric, adopted this principle, laying off the bottom 10% of his managers while rewarding the top 20% with stocks. This rank and yank strategy earned him the nickname Neutron Jack. Under his leadership, GE had become the most valuable company in the world. But this system was only beneficial for the short term. When Welch left, he took his expertise with him. We must remember that a true leader creates a long-lasting legacy and distributes power amongst the organization's people by building and protecting them. Unfortunately, using layoffs to meet target numbers had become the trend. Leaders have overlooked the fact that people are not expendable resources. By the 1990s, the culture of empathy within corporations was not to be seen. Stock manipulation and financial fraud increased. Luckily, in more recent years, modern thinkers have enlightened us about how employee value is greater than shareholder value. Boom and bust. Eventually, Welch himself had expressed his realization that focusing on shareholder value had been the dumbest idea in the world. Many big companies have taken a deep dive by cutting corners to meet short-term goals, creating much more damage to themselves and to other entities in the long run. Welch responded by saying that a company's main constituencies are employees, customers, and products. Leadership by the people. James Sinek, co-founder of Costco, conducted business in a way that is completely opposite to Welch. Sinek hadn't been a household name, but for good reason. He let his people take the credit. The balanced culture he promoted is the main reason his company has thrived throughout the years. His support for a culture of empathy, a strong circle of safety, has enabled him to ensure the survival of his company long after he's gone. In the recession of 2008, Costco still gained annual profits over $1 billion when they had been paying the highest wages in retail business. All leaders must follow his example and remember that customers won't love a company until its employees love it first. A society of addicts. At the center of all our problems is us. Enlightenment. Before the age of reason, people didn't want to believe that the negligence of doctors could spread disease. During the 18th and 19th centuries' puerperal fever epidemic in Europe and America, doctors weren't required to sterilize their tools or wash their hands during treatment, indirectly causing the further spread of sickness. Those who had been enlightened enough to criticize this were shot down until 12 years later when the medical community admitted responsibility. The same ideas apply to leaders. Whenever they are the cause of the problem, they have to be ready to admit it. A very modern addiction. The availability of addictive substances like alcohol, nicotine, and drugs has given humans a shortcut to the dopamine high. The human body wasn't built for these conditions, and so the chemical that was designed to help us survive is now rewarding us for destructive behavior. It is the same with today's corporate cultures. Incentive systems have created a dopamine-driven addiction to performance. Have a dopamine addiction. You earned it. Like our prehistoric ancestors in a successful hunt, the modern business world gives us dopamine shots with each target hit. But the unbalanced culture, dominated by short-term goals and personal incentives, has discouraged collaboration, hindering the development of a circle of safety. Like all addictions, this dopamine-driven system has consequences. A total disregard for others in the name of self-interest. At any expense. The quality of the news business has declined further and further as what used to be an unbiased public service has become a capitalist enterprise. In response, media regulations were implemented to make sure that the news industry doesn't become profit-driven. Yet, the news has ended up feeding the consumer's mind with overblown entertainment rather than socially relevant facts. The problem comes from media executives who are driven by ratings and not purpose. If only these execs would set aside the drive to win and give way to service for the people, the news business would become a healthy organization once more. More. The dopamine-driven boomer generation has created systems within the banking industry that broke the law to serve self-interest, and any attempts to fix the corrupt system were repealed. This created the numerous economic crashes of the past decades. Sinek recognizes the impending threat to the entire nation's circle of safety as one addicted generation is replaced by another. The abstract generation. The biggest losers. The greatest generation raised their children, the boomers, to the life of plenty that they never got to enjoy. In turn, the boomers raised their children to be wary of those who stand in the way of what they want. And so, Generations X and Y have developed a sense of entitlement, a form of impatience driven by the misconception that success and happiness come instantly. They grew up in an economy that puts numbers first before people, a culture of abstraction that could make them the biggest losers courtesy of their parents' excess. The distracted generation. Growing up surrounded by many technologies, Generation Y assumed that it was great with multitasking. In truth, it is merely being distracted. The proof is out there. Between 2000 and 2010, cases of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, have spiked. Children are now developing an addiction to distraction caused by activities like text messaging and online correspondence. If the phone rings while we're driving, we feel the necessity to look despite the safety risk. Gen Y is getting its dopamine high from things that satisfy faster and now. Commitment becomes harder, and addressing the problems of society come in the form of raising awareness rather than remedies. The youth is driven by dopamine shots from campaigning for causes rather than serotonin and oxytocin rewards from actually helping others. This allows antisocial behavior to fester. The dire scenario. Disillusioned, the younger generations have become more inclined to depression, suicide, and the antisocial mindset. Sinek predicts that it will only get worse with future generations because they will have grown up relying on prescription drugs and online support groups rather than biological bonds of friendship and love. Our primitive mammal brain leads us to conclude that without a sense of belongingness, we must be abandoned and left for dead. The good news is that we hold the solution ourselves. Becoming a leader. Step 12. We are the architects of our own demise. The first step to recovery from our modern addiction, like in Alcoholics Anonymous, is to admit that we are addicted. In AA, those who find sobriety are the ones that complete Step 12, the commitment to help another person fight the addiction. AA meetings are conducted in recreational centers and basements rather than online chat rooms for a reason. Real connections where people feel safe are required to beat the condition. These bonds last well after the program. AA is a perfectly built circle of safety. In oxytocin, we trust. The presence of serotonin in our biological design is for the purpose of reinforcing relationships. It works best with feelings of trust and love that are made possible by oxytocin. This chemical has functioned towards prevention rather than cure. There is evidence that high levels of oxytocin gained from acts of selflessness actually prevent addiction in the first place. It suppresses cortisol, helps us live longer, and solidifies the circle of safety wherein we draw strength from honest human bonds, void of self-preservation. Through this, difficulties seem easier to endure. Shared struggle. Want not, waste anyway. 50% of our food resources are discarded as waste. This is the consequence of having much more than what is essential for survival. Our biggest challenge now is to collectively feel the burden of commoditization and pull together to eradicate it. What used to be marvels of innovation have lost their value due to abundance, especially when we don't have to work for them anymore. Our best days at work. The fondest memories we have from work are usually those where hardships were shared. We recall with affection not the struggle, but the camaraderie that, through the feel-good reward given by oxytocin, helps us grow closer biologically. Thus, we must redefine the hardship of this modern age of abundance, not by living in extreme austerity, but by confining our futures according to our means. Redefining the struggle. Our abundant society has become stagnant like a large, successful corporation. We are no longer driven to survive because we have everything we need and more. Thus, we must frame our goals according to our size. For instance, Bill Gates aims for Microsoft to put a PC on every desk. Despite the company's massive achievements, this goal is a long way from being accomplished, thereby inspiring further innovation. If all leaders do the same and give their people a challenge that towers over their resources but not their abilities, the people will do everything to overcome it. The value of purpose. Stanley Milgram's experiment on human obedience and authority demonstrated how belief in a power higher than the scientist gave the subject strength against following orders blindly. In the case of society, the drive to serve oneself ranks lower than service to others. We draw more inspiration from causes bigger than ourselves. In the end, we need leaders who can give us the ultimate cause that will encourage commitment to one another. We need more leaders. Johnny Bravo explains that empathy is a service that a leader owes to everyone. Sadly, many of today's leaders follow Jack Welch's approach, so much so that the entire economy is unbalanced. Although the movement we want to push for is huge, this change can only happen gradually. We must start to do small acts of goodness towards others one day at a time, and in doing so, become the leaders ourselves. There is one resounding challenge presented to us in this book. Step up and become leaders ourselves, so that our global community can have a culture of empathy and eradicate the culture of selfishness that threatens to kill us. This is the only way that mankind can develop a worldwide circle of safety that will protect it from self-destruction. Simon Sinek shows us that this goal is possible, providing concrete examples of admirable men and women who have answered this call to action, giving emphasis on the strong foundations found within successful companies and in the military. Johnny Bravo shared with his team an incorruptible bond because he was void of self-interest, a true leader. He put his people first. He treated his men like family. And because of the healthy culture he promoted, they escaped enemy fire and survived, a reflection of how all other organizations may overcome external dangers and threats to survival. We overlook the fact that the answer to sustaining human organizations has actually been in our hands all this time. The biggest problem of today is that humanity has managed to view people as nothing but variables towards selfish gain and personal accomplishments. It may seem like a complex modern issue with a complex modern solution, but the truth is we can reference the efficacy of our primitive tribal systems to address this. Sinek reminds us of how Paleolithic man valued cooperation and trust within their communities, allowing mankind to become a successful species. They didn't study anthropological theories, business plans, or combat strategies to defeat the external forces that threatened them. They relied on naturally occurring chemicals in human physiology: endorphins, dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, all of which create an incentive system that encourages essential human behaviors. They make us feel good whenever we commit acts that benefit not only ourselves, but the rest of the tribe, and they suppress any negative feelings that may discourage us from performing our responsibilities to the group. A natural balance between these chemicals must be achieved, and a leader must oversee this balance by setting the organization on the right course. When a leader's actions are based on this primitive framework, this organization can overcome anything. He will have established trust and respect, so much so that even when he breaks the rules, the people swear by his judgment, trusting that he won't do anything to harm the tribe. The problem with today's leaders is that they abuse trust and power, lie to their people, impose dictatorship, break the law for self-interest, and regard their constituents as expendable resources. This is a dangerously pure capitalist approach that creates a culture of fear and self-preservation, eventually leading to the organization's collapse. It's hard to get back on the right track because modern society is distracted and weighed down by addiction to unnatural, destructive chemical highs sourced from man-made substances and technology. Sinek states that we are at the center of our problems. Arnold Toynbee, British historian, said that civilizations don't die from murder, but from suicide. We need to move from the stagnation of our destructive abundance towards real, long-term survival. The necessity of good leadership doesn't mean we rely on one person only. We can breed good leaders who can take us to a better future by first becoming the selfless and empathetic leader. In the mess hall, that is this world, each one of us must be willing to eat last.